Thanks for tuning in to the Positively Green podcast. I'm Kelsey Jorissen, farmer, educator, and the crunchiest of Earth Mamas.
I'm Becca Tetzlaff, blogger, educator, and lover of all things green beauty, organic skincare, and holistic living. We're a pair of sustainable living ladies that with every episode empower you to live a green life you'll love. So, today's episode is sponsored by Osea Malibu, the original plant-based, results-driven skincare line. Osea stands for Ocean, Sun, Earth, and Atmosphere, and they're a skincare line that I've personally used myself for a couple years now, and I just really love them and recommend them. All of their products are infused with sustainably sourced, organic Patagonian seaweed and active botanicals that create a nutrient and mineral-rich, bioavailable base. They are founded and run by a family of women too, which is really awesome. Osea is non-toxic, cruelty-free, vegan, and made with love in California. And I think you guys will appreciate this, but all of their products are sustainably packaged in glass, and you know we're all about that here on the Positively Green podcast. So if you're looking for some product recommendations, I personally love their Blemish Balm, Hyaluronic Sea Serum, Ocean Cleansing Mud, and their Black Algae Face Mask, but they seriously have so many awesome products. So you can find them at oseamalibu.com/positivelygreen, and we'll also put a link to that in the show notes for you. And Osea did provide a coupon code you guys can use, so when you're at checkout, you can just enter the code POSITIVELYGREEN10, and you can get $10 off your first purchase of $50 or more. So thank you, Osea, for sponsoring this podcast, and we'll get to today's episode.
So our guest today on the podcast is a super cool dude.
Oh yeah.
He is the coolest. Daniel DeBaun is an internationally recognized expert in EMF radiation, EMF shielding, and EMF-related health issues, with a special focus on the effect of exposure from mobile devices such as laptops, tablets, and cell phones. Daniel's concern regarding the health impact of EMF emissions grew from over 30 years of engineering experience in the telecommunications industry, where he held a variety of executive positions at SAIC, Telcordia, AT&T, and Bell Labs. He is the co-author of Radiation Nation, The Fallout of Modern Technology. Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us on the Positively Green podcast. We're so excited to chat today with you about all things EMFs.
Kelsey, Becca, thank you so much for inviting me. I do really appreciate having the time to chat about this subject, and hopefully we can help your audience have a little better understanding of this world.
Yeah,
I think it's going to be really helpful, and I think this is a topic that a lot of people maybe just don't really have a great understanding of. So why don't we just start really basic level here? What is EMF, and where does it even come from? What are some common sources?
Okay, 100 years ago, the only source of electromagnetic radiation was from nature, and there was a very, very, very low emissions, something like 10 hertz. Very, very low power level. Fast forward to today, all of our electric devices emit some form of electromagnetic radiation, and all the portable devices that have cell phone communications to the cell tower, laptops communicating to a Wi-Fi, all of these devices that are around us, they're also generating what is known as radio frequency or microwave emissions. The combination of both the extremely low frequency emissions and the portable device emissions is accumulating in our environment like never before.
So basically everything that's around us nowadays.
yeah, it's really true. It never existed. I often like to point out that cows don't emit electromagnetic radiation. In other words, by large, nature doesn't. It's only man-made stuff. And it's only in the last 10 years or so that it's really become an issue, because we have it right next to our bodies every day, all around us. So it's only recently that we find all these devices around us. And these devices we have no history with because they're so new, yet we're now learning, slowly but surely, that there are biological impacts to our bodies. Our health is impacted by exposures to these emissions. So we need to all understand what they potentially are in our lives.
Absolutely. Before we dive into those minor health effects or major health effects, can you walk us through some of those sources in the home that we would typically overlook when it comes to EMFs?
Yes. When you blow your hair in the morning when you take a shower, there's 100 milligauss of emissions. That's a lot of stuff. That's a byproduct of the power being created in your blower. When you use a toaster, a lot of electromagnetic radiation, extremely low frequency stuff, maybe 50 milligauss is coming out of that. Your refrigerator. So all the electronics in your devices that are running on AC power, the power that runs your house, all of those devices emit an emission. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, when you have a laptop, a tablet, a cell phone, they're transmitting electromagnetic radiation, RF. So by the way, to help understand, when I say RF microwave, you want to think about it this way. When you have a microwave oven and you take a piece of meat and you put inside a microwave oven and you turn it on, the water in between all the cells getting hotter and oscillating those cells. So when you have cooked meat, it's because of the oscillation of the cells that cooks the meat. So the microwave is a thermally emitting emission. And that emission is about 1.3 gigahertz. Remember 1.3. When you use a Wi-Fi, you have a laptop that connects to your router, that's 1.4 gigahertz. It's virtually the same frequency as your microwave. The power levels are different, but it's still a thermal emitting signal. So when you put it to your head, standards says your head can't heat up more than 2 degrees. So you're actually cooking your brain to a little bit of level. And that's why when you talk about these kinds of emissions in your life, and you use this stuff a lot, it does have a debilitating effect on where you're placing these devices.
Let's first start with minor health effects maybe, and then jump into the more serious ones.
Sure. Before I get to that, let me talk about just one other form of electromagnetic radiation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, the sun, the light, they call it visible light. That is electromagnetic radiation. And so one of the things that is like wonderful is when you go outside, you're sitting on the ground early in the morning, you're capturing the vitamin D that's coming from the sun. And so that's a really, really good thing. However, if you're looking at a screen monitor, a TV, you're looking at man-made blue light. That's a component of the visible spectrum. Believe it or not, that's also an emission that can be dangerous to you. So we can talk about that a little bit more as we go on, but that's actually becoming more and more an important sort of understanding that these devices creating artificial light actually can have damages that have never existed in our environment. So you have a headache that may be bothering you a little bit and you don't sort of think about it too much, but it may be related to the Wi-Fi transmitting that's sitting right next to you. You pick up a cell phone in your hand, all of a sudden it starts tingling a little bit. That's bothering your hand while that device is generating an RF signal that's sort of bothering your fingers. Believe it or not, your eyes can be affected, as I said before, with the blue component. Your skin gets a rash directly related to a laptop on your lap. They call it toasted skin syndrome. There are so many of the very, very minor kinds of things that enter your life, and you don't even consider it that the source is actually the emissions in your environment. So you go from there on one side of the spectrum, just slightly bothersome kinds of impacts, to pretty serious stuff where you have brain fog, but serious brain fog. You have thinking that's not quite as up to par as you think it should be. And what we're learning actually in more recent years is that there really is a direct correlation between increased use of cell phones and the operating brain. And so there can be more serious supervisory functions of the body, which is developed by the brain, that's impacting a whole many other cascading kinds of effects within the body that you don't even know about. And of course, we know from recent research that constant exposure to these kinds of things through laboratory studies, we've found in epidemiology that your cell can break down. The cell can break down because there's excess calcium penetrating the membrane of the cell, and the cell ultimately becomes damaged in a DNA way or mutating the cell. So it can be that extreme, where it can be the precursor to cancers and tumors and other things like that. So it's a very large spectrum, and we're only sort of beginning to understand it in science because it hasn't been around very long, and we're now seeing this in the field.
I have a question. Is there a healthy limit per day, Daniel, for EMFs and radiation?
But believe it or not, there's not really very strong evidence. But we know that if you use it more than 4 hours a day, you're like 3 times more likely to get cancer.
Wow.
If you live by a cell tower, let's say you're within 1,000 feet of a cell tower, you are 3 times more likely to get cancer as a result of that. That's statistical study work that's pretty indisputable. So we know exposure, particularly long-term, can have pretty serious debilitating effects.
I know I've gotten a lot of questions from people before that they're concerned because they live near like power lines. Is that something too that's pretty concerning?
Remember when we talked about the hair blower, the toaster? That's called extremely low frequency emissions. When you have power lines that come near your house, that's 60 cycle emissions. That's the extremely low frequency stuff. You can take a light bulb under the high-powered, a fluorescent light bulb, and you can walk underneath it and it lights up. Is there power? Of course there is. If you're deciding to buy a house and you're within 1,000 feet of a high-powered wire, don't buy it, because that's long-term exposures, and we know for sure there are debilitating body functions that occur over time.
So I'm curious then about substations, the areas that have a lot of the power coming from, that station itself. We live within a mile of a substation.
You're perfectly fine.
Oh, interesting.
One of the things we'll talk about is distance. Believe it or not, if you have a cell phone to your head, it's the worst serious space you can put a cell phone. If you take it and put it 4 foot away from you, 98 of potential danger is gone. It's the simple distance from the device that is protective. There are logarithmic drop down in power levels, so you really are much safer the farther you are. So if you're a mile away from a high-powered 10,000 volt line, don't worry about it. But if you have it within 1,000 feet, move.
So then what about people are really into these wearables lately, like smartwatches, things that are attached to them for 24 hours a day. Is that concerning too?
Okay. Yeah, the answer is absolutely. And let me tell you the story. I like yoga. I practiced yoga for years. And I had a teacher. She came over to me right around Christmas, and she showed me this device she put on her wrist. And she was so proud of wearing it. And I looked at her and I said, "Are you nuts? You know this is what I do for a living, and you have a Bluetooth connection that goes 30 to 50 feet. The power of that device goes 30 to 50 feet. It is about 3 watts of power, and it's constantly transmitting. And we know, for example, through study work, if you take a Bluetooth signal, which is 3 watts, and you put it to your head, and your blood-brain barrier is down because you had a concussion, we know through study work it can mutate the cell of the frontal lobe."
Oh, that's scary.
Wow.
Yeah, so do I recommend people using those devices? Absolutely not. If it doesn't transmit and it only spurts every 24 hours, that's very, very different. So it really depends on the device you're putting around. If it's a spurty detail that occurs quickly and not long-term, you're fine. But if it's a constant transmission, stay away from it.
That's great to know. I've always been on the fence about the smartwatches because of how great they are to track, your sleep schedule and all those things. And I've been wary because of EMFs and radiation. So this is very helpful.
What's funny about that is I'm working with sensitivity projects, like hypersensitivity projects. And we want to monitor body function. And so we had a device just like those portable devices you put on your wrist. And we were talking to them about what body functions we want to track. And they had a constant transmitting Bluetooth. So I said, get rid of it, because you defeat the purpose of it. You're going to have all these metrics and you're going to kill me.
Right. So in your book, Fallout of Modern Technology, you mention a recent study of 350 children ages 6 months to 4 years. They found that nearly all of the children, 96.6%, used mobile devices, and most started using them before age 1. Why are children especially vulnerable to EMF radiation, and how do we minimize their exposure to it?
Okay, so I'll get slightly technical again about the standard. When the standard was created 30 years ago or so, it was based on a cell phone. That was an analog signal, and it was using a male model that was 6 foot and saying that's the model for the standard. It was a 6 foot male, and they averaged how much penetration that 1.6 watts would penetrate into the brain. And what the standard ultimately said is, we will not let it heat up more than 2 degrees, and that signal can't penetrate more than 1 inch on the average. And it is for a man who occasionally uses a cell phone. Well, I was there when they did it 30 years ago, and I had a cell phone, but I had no one to call. So I was never on my cell phone. So the standard was good then.
Yeah.
And then today, you have 6-year-old children using cell phones for periods of time, minutes at a time, hours at a time. What are they experiencing? Well, that same standard, 1.6 watts per kilogram standard, literally goes through their head. And what you may not have picked up when I mentioned it, it was only the thermal they were concerned about.
Yeah.
Not the biological. And the biological impact, we know for sure, is far more damaging in time than any thermal impact could ever be. You know, when I said it could be cancer, that is the breakdown of a cell. That breakdown of a cell is a biological response to the exposure. It's not a thermal response.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's good to know. And I didn't really understand the difference until now.
Yeah.
And remember, when you're a 6-year-old child, your membrane is much, much thinner. Your soft tissue is softer than an adult 6 foot male. So the whole biological path it takes is much less impeded when you're a child. And then even as a teenager, you don't have a fully matured skull. It's not all the way through, but it's maybe halfway through. If you're a female, it's more like a quarter of a way through, not 1 inch. Certainly, the male model does not articulate well the female body function.
Right.
Just because, children are like smaller. And then what about we all have small pets in our homes. How do you know how that's affecting them just because they're so little?
One of the things we'll maybe want to chat about a little bit later is the impact to the brain. We know that what I refer to as ambient electromagnetic radiation is your whole room, what's in your whole entire room. You may have a Wi-Fi, you may have a cell phone, you may have a Bluetooth. There's so many sources in the room. All of those transmitting sources are filling that room. And a way to refer to all that sort of stuff, all of the energy in that room, is talking about it like it's a ambient. Ambient hasn't existed in our lives up to only the last 10, 20 years. And when we talk about ambience, we talk about room ambience that is increasing the more we use more devices. So if you look at a classroom, for example, and you look at the power ambient within that room, it's actually 1/3 the power level of a transmitter. It's 1.6 watts. That's huge compared to when it was nothing, only 20 years ago. And so our bodies are trying to sort of figure out what to do with this.
So I've heard you've mentioned you should hold your cell phone away from your head when using it, or put it on speakerphone, and don't hold it directly against your ears. So What does it mean when your ear feels warmer after a conversation on a cell phone?
Actually, that's the thermal impact. When that is your ear cooking up to 2 degrees on the average. No one bills anything to the absolute, so 1.6 watts per kilogram could actually drift 15% higher, so it's almost 2 watts. And the 2 degrees is on the average. Yours could be 3 degrees because of the biological composition. And so you're literally heating up the cells. They're oscillating. So you feel that. So that is a thermal response. But we also know there's a biological response. And it is a reaction of your body to the emission. So the heating up may not necessarily be a thermal response. It could be a biological response. So it can be both, right?
Is there an issue with using headphones while you're talking on a cell phone?
When you have a Bluetooth, which is the wireless earphones,
Yeah.
and then you compare it to the earphones that are wired and plugged in, versus having a cell phone to your head, of course they're much better because you're actually reducing the power levels that are being created and interfering with your body. But Bluetooth is 0.3 watts per kilogram, and as I mentioned before, these cells can break down at 0.1 watts. And when you have a Bluetooth signal going through your head, it is hitting the frontal lobe. And 1/3 the power level of the Bluetooth communication. So that is not the way to go necessarily. But a better way is to go with wired earbuds because that even reduces it further. But if you're really, really concerned, there are actually devices out there where those electrical connections are eliminated and they become acoustical connections. So you eliminate completely any of the power levels to the earphones through an acoustical link, and you eliminate the concern of those earbuds as a result of that.
I think in a little bit we'll get more into devices and ways you can prevent, but I still have a few more questions.
Sure.
We were mentioning when they were developing the standards and everything, but as far as the government and are there any regulations in place, or is there anything really being done to kind of protect people from all this exposure?
I'm going to answer that in 2 ways. The first is there are government standard body, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that has for the last 50 years the responsibility to establish what the standards are for the electronics in the environment. They don't have biological experts. They don't have clinical experts. They are, by and large, engineers. So they tend not to be too concerned with the kind of standards that ensure protection for the user of cell phones. Again, 30 years ago, a standard was created for a signal that's no longer used. So the standards even defined today are not reflecting the technology. And so we had the cell phone that was created, then we had the first generation, the second generation, the third generation, the fourth generation, all of them improving the communications. You can send messages now, you can look at each other. Up to 4G, the standard has been insufficient by a large body of the medical community. There's a lot of worldwide concern with scientific evidence to prove that these kinds of things are not so good for you. So there's that part. In other words, if you want protection, protect yourself. But now more recently, there's the next generation, the 5G generation.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Right? And so what does that mean? The FCC decided that was more important to get the technology into the consumer hand so we would have that superior position worldwide. And they concluded that they would approve the standards without any biological evaluations of any sort. In other words, you are a living guinea pig in a study of 5G. Now, the standard never reflected protection up to 4G, and 5G is all about increasing the rates of the speeds of the signal. Everything is around 2 to 2.5 gigahertz to up to 5 gigahertz with Wi-Fi. With the new 5G, it can go up to 60 gigahertz. Actually, it can go up to 300 gigahertz. So 60 gigahertz is really, really fast and allows you to download really, really big folders of content, videos of huge content, really, really fast. But it also is true that the transmissions are much faster, and we barely understand up to 2 gigahertz, no less, 60 gigahertz. So where we really don't know what the impact is, although there are many, it's controversial. There are quite a number of within the scientific community trying to argue that it's not a good thing.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, do you know of anybody pushing back on this? Because I've read about the 5G, towers being put up without anybody's consent. What is your take on the controversy and how people have pushed back on 5G?
I was pushing back on 4G. Right, and so 5G is far more, and it's not because I know it's going to kill you. It's because I don't know it won't kill you. We just don't have any work at all. If I'm to extrapolate from scientific research at a meta level, I would project there are far more concerns with 5G than we ever had with any 4G or lower generations. And there are many organizations and individuals. Dr. Ali Johansson is I really love the guy. He's a brilliant researcher, and out of Sweden, and he's been a strong voice. Dr. Powell, when I talked about breakdown of the cell to go to a mutated DNA damaged cell, that's Dr. Powell's work, and he's really, really concerned about the impact of 5G. And he's putting scientific evidence together. So there's that one side that's raising the concern, and of course the FCC's already approved it. So it's controversial. It's getting more controversial the realer it gets.
Yeah, absolutely. It scares me. I won't lie. I read about, what certain senators and congressmen and women say, and I feel like they just don't have any patience for science, and there's no precautionary principle whatsoever.
None at all. Absolutely none. I got to tell you a story. I work with a clinic, and Dr. Court leads the facility. And on the weekend, he called me up one day, and he said, "I've got a splitting headache. Something's really, really wrong." And I said, "Well, how the hell do I know what's going on? I'm not there, right?" But I said, "Explain to me your environment." And he talked about several things that potentially influenced it. And he then said, "Oh, I have a new cable service. It's a wireless cable service." And I said, "Well, you do?" And I said, "Go over to the router that's terminating the cable service, turn it over and tell me what it says." And it said 5G.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He could feel it because he's likely hypersensitive himself. So he had immediately began getting severe headaches and debilitating function. And he could feel it. So remember I mentioned something about if you're 1,000 foot from a cell tower?
Yeah.
So those transmitters are 60 watts. They have a lot of power. Your cell phone is 1.6 watts to give you a sort of relationship. So that 60 watts is being transmitted, it's going 5 miles, up to 5 miles. With 5G, you will have a cell tower right outside your front door. And it's going to be 20 watts because it needs all that power to go 750 feet maximum. So they can't go 5 miles anymore. They can only go 750 feet. So you have many, many more. In other words, your ambient is increasing with more levels of power than ever before at frequency rates that are much higher than ever before.
Yeah, that's crazy. And just how fast technology develops, it's like, where does it all stop? It's just kind of crazy to think about.
Well, I have a problem with is like there's all these new services that are touted as extremely important to the end user. I, for the life of me, can't find one I can't do today. And so what is the real motivation? Well, of course, there's the evolution of technology, which tends to be a driver not in the human race. But beyond that, it's money.
Right.
If we decided that we were going to go compete with cable service companies, we would look and say, look at that cable stuff. Look at those electronic devices, all those things you have to provide that service. It's all limited in the speeds it can go. Hey, I have a good idea. Let's go with 5G. And what we're going to do is put a tower out there so we don't have to put all the electronics, the cable plant, the wire, which is really the most expensive part of a plant, is the cable itself. We'll eliminate all that, and we'll bypass the competition. We'll give them a little router, and we bypass their service, and we make a lot of money. That's more the driver, I think. It's the technology that enables them to leapfrog in reducing costs and increasing service levels.
But they don't ever take into account the cost of, like, the human cost, right? Mm-hmm. The health cost. Like, that is just not something that shows up when they're doing their accounting. And
there's virtually no doubt. And I was in the telecommunications industry. And so I was sort of familiar with how everything sort of operates. And we were all engineers. We had no clue what the biological impact was or ever were concerned about it. I was more concerned about electronics interfering with other electronics, not electronics interfering with humans.
Right.
So, which should have been more the concern. So, another little story. I actually, because of that background that I have in telecommunications, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who was a very good personal friend of one of the largest cell phone companies in the country, and they were talking about things that can be used to protect yourself. Some stuff actually that I have an association with. And he said that I love what those things do, but I can never use them because I would be telling the markets these can be dangerous. So it was a choice where the monetized value of what they were doing would diminish if he showed there was potential dangers.
That's sad.
Yeah, it is. It's really sad.
So then I guess this kind of ties into our next question. Just like, given your background with telecommunications, is that kind of how you became aware of all these EMFs? And then what ultimately inspired you to start DefenderShield?
I love that question. Believe it or not, I ran the technical laboratories for the Bell system. My team were the source of technology standards and the source of ensuring standards are complied to. So I was pretty familiar with this. And as I mentioned, I was worried about technology interfering with other technology. Then my boys, who are not boys, they're adult men, and they had their laptops on their lap for hours. And my wife says, I want grandchildren. That can't be good for you. and so I thought about it a little bit. I thought about the power density of the signal, and I said, Dad, there's absolutely no way. There's no way that can be a problem for the human. None. And then I decided, well, just to sort of check it out, let's go look at some of the medical research that's been done. And I was really, really surprised. After 3 to 4 hours, 25% of the male sperm is immobile. And so that's temporary or potentially can be long-term. And as you know, the sperm count of men over the last 10 years have been diminishing every year. And so is there a direct link? How do you prove it? But I certainly know that studies have been done that have proven the temporary as well as the more permanent impact with devices near your body. So I began looking more and more, and I said, well, look, I'm an engineer, so I'll build you something that shields the emissions from hitting your body. And so I started with something that simply shielded the laptop on your lap. It was by accident that I actually got involved with it 7-8 years ago. And it turned out I had a fairly hefty experience on the electronic side, as well as sort of the shielding side, because I was a mechanical engineer by trade. And so I was able to sort of combine that and begin creating what I thought was important, because I knew that I couldn't rely on anybody else to protect them. I needed to do it myself if I thought it was a problem, and I did.
Well, you get a gold star for being a great dad.
Oh, thank you. By the way, I don't have any grandchildren still.
We'll send them an email. We'll tell them to get on it.
Thank you very much.
So I would love to know, instead of getting rid of all the tech in our homes and living off the grid, what are some other practical tips for protecting ourselves and lessening exposure?
There's some actually pretty simple stuff you do. You know, when I was talking about the ambient, I use an analogy: bees in the room. Look around your room and find out where all the transmitters are within a room, and ask yourself, do you need it on or off? For example, if you have a cell phone and it's sitting next to you, do you need the Bluetooth? Do you need the Wi-Fi connection? Not necessarily. You're not using it necessarily all that often, and if you do, you can turn it on. So by taking those 3 transmitters and cutting it down to 1, you have a 3-to-1 ratio of ambient reduction in that room. Look around the room, find out what may or may not be needed, turn it off if you don't need it, and then turn it on when you do. That simple process actually reduces the ambient, which is actually fairly important in modern technology, because you have Bluetooth coming out of your speakers now. They've eliminated the wires, which is good, but they've replaced it with 3 watts of power that's in the room. So do you really need that, or is it easier to run a wire? When you put a computer together, I have an office laptop and I have a home laptop. I don't use Wi-Fi. I make sure it's Ethernet connected. Then when it's Ethernet connected, I'm not worried, because there's no 2.4 or 5 gigahertz signal being transmitted near my body. So there's regimen about trying to turn off things you don't need. At night in a bedroom, you have to turn everything off. Never have a cell phone near your pillow. Don't have a Wi-Fi on. In fact, I always recommend that. Get a little $10 power control, a little switch timer, where you plug it into the wall and it turns off at 10 o'clock at night and turns on at 7 in the morning. You're eliminating those bees in that room by simply spending $10 and turning it off. If you turn all these things off, that does have an important improvement in your environment. If you're going to be having a cell phone that you want to make a phone call with or receive a call, and you want to have it active, don't put it 1 foot away from you. Put it 5 feet away from you. And that simple movement, 1 foot away, 80% of the danger is gone. 4 foot away, 98% of the danger is gone. By simply moving it away from you, you eliminate that signal from danger to your body. The other very important thing that we touched on was the time in which you are on these devices. If you can reduce the amount of time in using this, in other words, the exposure time, you actually improve the likelihood that there's no damage to the body. For example, if you use a cell phone 5 minutes every day for the rest of your life, you'll be 200 years old. If you use it 6 hours on the average a day, you are 3 to 4 times more likely to have cancer. So by using it more, you actually increase the potential. So always, from a cautionary measure perspective, you always want to reduce the time. So time and distance are your best friends. And of course, you can eliminate them in your environment, or you can shield those in your environment, whatever you choose.
What is your take on putting phones into airplane mode while you're sleeping?
I don't like anything. An airplane mode does eliminate the transmitter, and that's good. But there's a periodic ping that occurs. It's not terribly significant, but it's a trickle that occurs that may not have to be there. I was talking with a really, really bright lady. I told her to get everything out of her bedroom, and she was placating me. She, oh, yeah. No problem. I want better sleep. I was explaining the impact of melatonin creation and all that kind of stuff. And she didn't believe me. And then a month later, she calls me up and she says, my husband and I are sleeping. We took the cell phone away, and it really did make a difference. And it really does. It disrupts the biological functions of the body. And, of course, the most sensitive being the frontal lobe stuff. We haven't talked about it, but I did just hint on melatonin. It disrupts the melatonin. In fact, electromagnetic radiation, it actually suppresses your immune system. It weakens your body's ability to defend itself. And so is it a big deal? Well, hopefully it's not, but why would you want to risk being more exposed? And of course, with melatonin, it's literally a process that's being interfered with. It's the creation and the implementation. The body naturally goes into a cycle where there's a creation of melatonin in the last 2 hours before sleep. So you really want to be able to control that. And by the way, that's the sort of that mechanic is why you really should think about looking at tablets or your laptop at night, 2 hours before you go to sleep. If you choose to do that, you should really block the blue light that's coming in. Why? Because it's disrupting melatonin. Is that a problem? Well, now your circadian rhythm is screwed up. Ultimately, you'll never figure out what's going on with you, and it all started because blue light was impacting your melatonin creation.
Yeah, it kind of like tricks your body into thinking it's daytime and it should be awake and alert. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I've been hearing a lot about the blue light recently, and they make the glasses that block it, and then they also have the on your devices you can shift the light. So
Yeah, really, really important. We're learning that it goes far beyond the melatonin. There are other body functions that are being disrupted. And of course, there's premature macular degeneration that's been linked to the blue light. There's a myriad of stuff, but we're learning more and more that it's not just that. Even your balance is being screwed up a bit with the blue light, believe it or not.
I have to say, I've been wearing blue blockers now for like 3 years. I have a pair of Swannies. When I am stuck somewhere without them, I immediately feel the difference. I immediately feel this frazzled, haggard sort of like vibration in my head, and my eyes feel tired.
Yeah, dry eyes.
Yeah, it's just crazy the difference now that I'm very sensitive to it and much more aware of it.
Yeah, that's a really important message. I had a physician call me up one day, and she told me about this person working in her office that had dry eye for the last 10 years. And I said, well, what do you think the problem is? And, I don't know what it is. So I've been giving her drops. And I said, go get a pair of blue light blocking glasses and then call me back in a week. And her dry eye for over 10 years disappeared within 2 hours.
Wow, that's crazy.
So it was like, for her, it was pretty debilitating. And the answer to fix it was pretty simple.
Mm-hmm. I also want to touch on smart meters. Can you give us any more information about that? I've been hearing so much lately about them and like shielding yourself from them, so I'd love to hear your take.
Okay, that's all about bees in the room, distance, and time. If you have a meter sitting on your side of your garage and there's a 20-foot inside the garage and your bedroom's on the other side, in other words, over 20 foot away, there's absolutely nothing to be worried about. The power levels are non-existent by the time they hit you, by and large, damaging power levels. And so you never worry about it. Now, if that same meter is on your bedroom wall on the outside and you have your headboard right directly on the other side of the wall, take that bedroom bed and move it to the other side, or better off, move it outside the room. They ping. It's not constant, but they ping. That can potentially disrupt the brain functionality, believe it or not. I don't panic about it because distance is your best friend and you don't have to worry about it if you're far enough away. It's only when it's really, really close and where you're spending a lot of time. If you're not going to be spending, if the meter is by your kitchen and you don't like to cook, that means you don't have to be in it very often, then you're fine. But if it's on a bedroom wall, it's really a serious problem.
So then what advice would you give to people who live in big cities and are always and heavily exposed to a lot of this type of radiation?
You know, it's funny. I was at a conference and I was asked the question, what should I do? They just put a cell tower, literally right outside my window. And it was right next to my bedroom. And what should I do? And I said, move. And I was really legitimately concerned because there's 60 watts transmitting into her bedroom all day, all night. And so there's a way of remediating that where they can actually come in and put shielding walls up, shielding you with a medium between the source and you. So there are ways of remediating it, but it's a hard thing to do, especially in concentrated environments like that.
So would you recommend getting out and getting a nature bath? Go forest bath, taking a hike, letting your body...
I absolutely do. Honestly, it's time. The time you spend. Like, for example, I was asked, can you shield a meter? And I said, of course I can. And so that's a RF transmitting meter. That's the smart meter. And they had that meter next to another 100 meters. And so they wanted to shield the RF for the one. I said, but how about the other 99? Not only that, but it's the extreme low frequency emissions, not the RF that you really should be worried about with that close proximity to so many bees in the room. There are certain things you can fix, and there are certain things you can try to minimize the best you can. Your immediate environment, you control. So minimize the best you can, and you don't worry about the rest, in my opinion.
I wanted to ask you if you heard at all about the Amish in Wisconsin who won the suit against the power line companies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I would love to get your opinion on that.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I tell the story about smoking. When I was 12 years old, which was quite a number of years ago, I wanted to be a big man, so I smoked a lot. I smoked a lot, meaning a couple of cigarettes every so often in the attic where no one could find me. And at that time, did you know science knew there was a direct link to cancer? They knew it. But it never became knowledge, a public knowledge, until how many years later? 30 some odd years later. And so smoking was bad for you. They knew it. And you were a acceptable collateral damage all that intermediary times. Now we know because in court they lost. So it was not because science didn't know what they were talking about. It was not because a lot of people were not making a bunch of noise. It was because literally it took the arm of the court ultimately to change what was going on. The example of the Amish bringing that to court and winning is sort of like the beginning of that. We know in Italy the same thing occurred where a man died from frontal lobe cancer. And so they won. So slowly but surely, the human race is sort of dealing with this, and I think the most effective way of changing is not yelling and screaming about it, but bringing organizations, companies that are driven by money to court.
So then I would love to get into DefenderShield, your business, and the products that you create to protect consumers. Can you talk to us about what makes DefenderShield special?
Well, I actually understand the environment pretty well. Running technical laboratories gives me an up against probably most others because I really try to understand the physics. I was able to take what I knew to products with my sons because we're not victims. I knew Wi-Fi is going to be around a long time, but I also knew I could take actions to help my boys in some way, not all ways, but in some ways. And so that's what I did. I never, ever intended to bring other products to the market. But as it turns out, the same technologies that I created for the Defender Pad was technologies that could be applied to many other devices, cell phones. In fact, I often tell the story, I was going to include it in cell phones. And I thought maybe people would come decide that they need that kind of protection in time. Then there was an article that I read about a 6-year-old girl demanding that she get a cell phone from her parents. A very healthy young girl. And she got the phone. She won her case. And her parents bought the phone. And she never put it down. Sadly, a year later, she had frontal lobe cancer and passed away.
Oh my gosh.
And so even though that's anecdotal, that's not scientific, that was more motivating to me than anything else. It was like, if she had a device that shielded that signal from her brain, that likely would not have happened. And so that drove me to modify what we had in technology into cell phones, and then into laptop protection. We now have blankets that protect, shield, particularly pregnant women. If you have a high level of exposure and you're in the first 3 months of a pregnancy, we know for sure that RF signals that are higher in some domains, in this case, the study was in San Francisco, where there is typically a higher ambient, they were three times more likely to have a miscarriage. So it's sort of important to not only protect yourself, but your kids too. So we're trying to find ways of bringing product to market to protect not just the individual, but kids as well, before they're even born.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's just so important what you're doing. I actually have the laptop pad, the Defender pad at home. So.
Oh, wow. That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had that for about a year, but I know a lot of people are really skeptical about these things. Like, do they actually work? So I'd love to hear you explain a little bit more about like the testing that you guys do.
Yeah, before I do that, I'm going to tell you how serious it is for a cell. The federal government did a study several years ago, NTP study, National Toxicity Program, part of the division of the federal government. They took a statistically significant epidemiology study and they processed it over several years. And their intent was to prove that there were no links to cancer. What they ended up having at the end of the day was direct links of statistically increased cancers to those rats and mice that were a part of that epidemiology. What made it different than everything else, it was statistical. In other words, they had 10,000 rats and patients. And so that's what makes it important. So there is truly a very real challenge that we have. More so than ever before, we've been able to confirm that there's direct links. And in fact, believe it or not, I think it's worse than that, because it's not the breakdown of a cell, it's the breakdown of body function that is more concerning. So we know that exists. And to answer your question, I actually understand more about establishing performance than most. But you can't rely on me stating that what I say is legitimate. So I went to an independent third-party FCC RF expert laboratory. I gave them my products and I said, tell me what it performs like. You tell me. And literally what we have in our claim statements are their research study results, not mine. So I tried to be as independent and as transparent as we could. You're always going to have controversy with this. One thing I would like to talk a tiny bit about is sort of emanating from the book. The book was created out of frustration. I was frustrated that the medical community in the testing world knew so much, and the medical community treating patients knew so little. And so sort of my goal and my son's goal, Ryan, was to create a space in which we try to define what the problem is and tell you the magnitude of the problem and things you can do about it. That's what prompted the book. Actually, it turns out that I've gone beyond that to some extent now, and I have, as I've mentioned before, there's a clinic. It's an EMF clinic, believe it or not, K2 Pinnacle Health. It's run by Dr. Court. He's electric hypersensitive himself, and he's taking people who are extremely hypersensitive. And by the way, more than 20% of the population is hypersensitive. It's an amazing statistic. And he's now helping people. He's associated with Jeanette Bessemer. She's running Electromagnetic Hypersensitivity Project. She has an advisory board of physicians, sleep experts, heart surgeons, and they're really trying to understand better what really this emissions is doing to us and what we can do about it. And so I'm really excited about the work they're doing. Because for some, particularly some in your audience, of that 20% I mentioned, 80% are women. We don't know why. But that's true for electric hypersensitivity. It's the same for multiple chemical sensitivity. More than 80% of those who are affected are women. We don't know why, but certainly your audience probably understands this more so than others.
For sure. This stuff is so important for them to hear, and I'm really excited to get this episode in their ears. Is there a place where our listeners can keep up with you and what you're doing with DefenderShield?
We actually have a monthly letter we issue that updates kind of things we're doing. There's a part of our website that's just for learning. We actually try to help everyone understand what we know through science that they should know. We have a whole section on 5G. We explain what it is. We help you understand it. And of course, there's virtually no study work to demonstrate that because there is none. But helping you understand what it is helpful. It's not a mystery. So there's the educational part that I think is very helpful for your listening audience. We try to be up to date with our Facebook. I do suggest getting the book. It turned out that it becomes a roadmap for maybe how you want to incorporate changes in your life. The importance of biological balance, the gut being where it needs to be, the vitamin, the minerals. All these aspects of our lives are sort of important to keep up as best we can, because in the presence of the ambient increasing in our environment, the body has to have a more difficult time protecting itself. So it's important to keep all those aspects of our life, exercise, all those things are important in our lives now, more so than ever before.
Okay, great. We'll be sure to put links to everything you mentioned in the show notes so our listeners can grab that. Where can they find a copy of the book?
They can go on our website, DefenderShield.com, and I think we have it on sale for $9.99. It's really, really important. Dr. Court uses this. He won't treat a patient if they don't read this book. Because it talks about oxidative stress, it talks about cell danger response, and all the kinds of things that predictive antibodies that you got to be worried about.
I think I'm going to have to put a copy in my husband's hands because he always has his laptop on his his goodies. Yeah. And I'm like, you know what, sir? This is not okay.
I have a great story about that. I knew a guy that was in Vietnam, and they used to have these radar guns. And they'd shoot the radar guns towards their groin area so they didn't have any children over there.
Oh, gosh.
And guess what? That's what he's doing as well.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Oh, well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the Positively Green podcast. It was a treat talking to you and learning all about EMFs today. We'll be sure to drop all of the info you shared with us in the show notes so listeners can check everything that you do out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me.
Daniel DeBaun's company, DefenderShield, makes a ton of awesome stuff. Blue light blocking glasses, laptop pads, phone cases, blankets, and so much more so you can protect yourself. They are all independently third-party tested like Daniel mentioned. And what's even better is they gave us a code for you listeners. If you want to receive 20% off your purchase at DefenderShield, use the code GREEN20. All caps. They also have a monthly newsletter where you can stay up to date on the latest EMF news and research.
All right. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to the Positively Green podcast. We would really, really appreciate it if you gave us a rating and a review, or, just find us on Instagram. You can always message us. We love hearing what you guys think about the episodes, the topics. We love getting suggestions from you. So don't be a stranger. Just reach out, and we really want to hear what you have to say. So until next time, we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye!